Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Attorney Maria Romina Bigumal, and it is my pleasure to be your host for today. This training program is developed by the Legal Education Board in partnership with Asian Development Bank, International Union for Conservation of Nature Academy of Environmental Law, and the UN Environment Program. We are now on the third session of the Environmental Law Teachers Online Training Program. And for a brief recap, last week we were graced by our three resource speakers to tackle issues, challenges, and benefits of teaching environmental law online. Last week's discussion gave us an overview of the current state of Philippine legal education and how it affected our faculty, our students, and our community. As a continuation of the lecture, we will have today the lecture on methodology in the teaching of environmental law. Before we get started, I'd like to go over our house rules and a quick guide on how to open a tab for later discussion. Please let us know if you could record this session today. We will only start recording if all parties consent to the recording. Mute your microphone while waiting for others to join in and when not speaking during the session. Use the chat box option if you have questions or comments, and click the reaction option to interact with our speakers and guests. Also, we would like to request everyone to turn off your video camera after the taking of the picture to lessen the amount of bandwidth. Now, for later discussion, we would like to guide our participants on how they can open a new tab in their browsers. So at the top of the Google Chrome window, next to the last tab, right? Click New Tab, or you may also use a keyboard shortcut. For Windows and Linux users, you can use Ctrl+T, and for Mac, use the sign as flash in the screen plus the letter T. Now for attendance purposes, I would like to request everyone to turn on their video camera for a quick picture. All right, so we will be taking our picture for today's attendance, and we would like to request everyone to give their most sweetest smile for today's session. So Angela, can you kindly assist us in the taking of pictures?
Right, everybody on three. I'm just waiting for some of the others to get their camera set up. 1, 2, and 3. Hold on. Okay, and then I'll shift over to the other windows. Hold on. 1, 2, and 3. Last one. Just wait for everybody's cameras to come online in this last window. 1, 2, and 3. All right, Mary, we're finished.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you, everyone. You may kindly close your video camera to lessen our bandwidth. So, all right, to begin our program, let me introduce to you our resource speaker for today. We have Professor Amanda Kennedy. Professor Amanda Kennedy has a PhD in law and Bachelor's of Law with first-class honors. She holds a graduate diploma in legal practice, a graduate certificate in law training, and is admitted as a lawyer in the New South Wales, Australia. She joined the Queensland University of Technology as a professor of law in 2019. Amanda's research interest falls predominantly within the area of agri-environmental law and include resources and land use law. She has conducted and funded several research, and one of these is under the Australian Research Council and other industry grants. She also published her work in both domestic and international journals, and including a monograph in Routledge Environmental Justice and Land Use Conflict. Amanda has taught across undergraduate and postgraduate programs concerning environmental law and natural resources government. She has recently contributed a textbook on environmental and planning and climate law in Queensland. Amanda has completed a graduate also of certificate in law teaching through Monash University and received a peer recognition for her teaching practice, including the Nexus Australasian Law Teachers Association citation for Excellence and Innovation in the Teaching of Law in 2014. So everyone, let us welcome Professor Amanda Kennedy. Prof.
I'm just checking, Maria. Are you able to see the presentation slides correctly?
Yes, Prof. Amanda.
That's wonderful. Well, hello, everybody. It is truly wonderful to be here with all 72 other of you here today in this brave new online world that we find ourselves in. I had a small interactive activity to begin with as you were all entering from the waiting room, and I will leave that open if you would like to continue to participate in that. It's just a small activity that we can do to maybe have a little wishful thinking about where we might go next when travel allows us to move beyond our national borders. So there is a link. Obviously, you won't be able to click to it from my presentation slide, but if you look in the chat box, there is a link provided there. Just go on and tell me where you'd rather be in the world right now. I found it rather interesting that for a group of people from the sunny, beautiful Philippines, that so many of you are yearning for a trip to Europe in what is becoming their winter. So I'm not sure if that means you've had a very hot period there in the Philippines right now, but good to see some great options for travel being entered in there. So please feel free to keep posting in that window. And as Maria explained, if you keep an additional web browser open on your device, we will have a few interactive activities throughout today's session that will just require you to go over to another browser window in addition to keeping the Zoom session open. If you do get stuck at any point, please just use the raise hand function to let us know, and we'll assist where we can. I can see that Maria has reposted that link, so thank you for that. So let's get underway, and I will declare from the outset that this is going to be very much a whirlwind trip today, looking at loads of different aspects of pedagogy and practice of teaching environmental law. So we are going to be covering quite a lot of ground today. If at any point you're not sure, if you want me to explain something, please just use the chat box function and one of the facilitators will bring it to my attention, or feel free to use the raise hand function too. We will pause at different points today as well for questions and answers. So I just want to be very clear that today we're really only going to be scratching the surface of some of the theories of learning and why they should underpin our approach to teaching in environmental law. For some of these concepts, people take months, even years to learn, and indeed they do form the focus of an entire degree of study. If you find yourself ever interested, you can undertake things like a graduate certificate in higher education, or you can also undertake things like a fellowship through the Higher Education Academy in the UK. So today we're going to start with a brief overview of theories of learning. Theories of learning derive from psychology and they explain how people learn. Why do we need to know this? Well, an understanding of educational theory can assist with designing and implementing effective strategies for student learning. And as we heard in the overview video just before we commenced today from some of the champions of environmental law teaching in the Philippines, it's important that we have effective teaching methods so that we can reach and inspire the next generation of environmental lawyers in our respective countries. So once we look at those theories of learning, we're then going to have a look at the concept of constructive alignment. And constructive alignment is an approach to teaching design that really holds that students need to be aware from the outset what it is that they are intended to learn, how assessment tasks will measure their attainment of those learning outcomes, and that learning activities need to then develop the skills and the knowledge and the understanding that we propose to measure through our assessment. So that will then lead us into thinking about the overarching learning environment and some of the key considerations there that we need to have an effective learning environment. We're going to look at the issue of student engagement, and I know that that was something that we talked about briefly last week. And we'll finish by briefly touching on the idea of reflective practice, which is really all about us as teachers reflecting and learning from our teaching experience in order to develop our own skills. Now, you may not even realise it, but simply being here today is a great example of reflective practice. So you're already doing it, perhaps without even realising. So let's get underway. We're going to have some breaks throughout, so don't worry, you won't be hearing just from me, and there'll be opportunities for questions. But do, if you want to ask a question at any point, do use the raise hand or the chat box function. So, you will recall perhaps this slide from last week where I talked to you briefly about these theories of learning. And I know there were a few comments asking for a little more detail. So that's what I'll touch upon now. So as I said before, theories of learning describe how people learn. And by being aware of how people learn, that can assist us in designing and implementing effective learning environments. So there are three predominant theories of learning. They are behaviorism, cognitivism, and constructivism. Now, in a moment, I'm going to give a little more of a detailed description of those theories of learning. And what I would encourage you to do is to make some brief notes or to jot down what you think are the key points. And that's going to be relevant to a small activity that we're going to do in a moment. So, behaviorism is our first theory of learning. And behaviorism views knowledge as a commodity that is transferred from the teacher to the student. So it's a very simple transactional interaction. So a behaviorist approach to learning then focuses on a stimulus and a response. In other words, we provide students with information, they repeat it back to us, and we tell them whether they're correct or incorrect. So we reward the behaviour that meets the goal. In other words, the understanding of the content. It's useful where we have broken information down into smaller amounts or broken large tasks into smaller tasks. And the focus here is really upon remembering key points through repetition and reinforcement. So the role of the educator is to develop approaches to teaching that strengthen that stimulus and response connection. So things like quizzes are a way that you can identify whether students can repeat back that information to you. Behaviourist approaches in law are ideal when we want to teach foundational concepts. So in law, that might include finding or identifying relevant legislation. Cognitivism, on the other hand, is a theory of learning that views knowledge as something that is more actively constructed by learners as they are required to process what they need to know. So here, the teacher moves into more of a role as a facilitator who guides discovery. Now, this theory of learning holds that learning is not just about receiving content, but the learner is also involved in processing that content as well. It's their mental processes of thinking and observing and also drawing on their own prior knowledge and linking that to new information. So it's very much a problem-solving theory of learning. So here, the role of the educator is to help students strengthen those structural and evaluative connections. The educator might impart knowledge and then provide opportunities for the student to strengthen that connection through applying that new knowledge to a new set of facts. So if this is already triggering something in your memory, a cognitivist approach is very obvious in law, where we provide our students with some legal information, and then we give them a hypothetical set of facts and ask them to apply that knowledge to the new set of facts. So that's a cognitivist approach, and it's underpinned by cognitivism as a theory of learning. Finally, we move into constructivism, and constructivism views learning as very individual. It is different for every person. It is controlled by the learner. And overall, it views knowledge as being constructed through interactions with a knowledge community. So learners will collaborate, they will share knowledge, they will co-develop knowledge through their experience. And knowledge is very much under this approach to learning, contextualized by the learner. They bring their own experiences to interpret and make sense of information, and to then propose a solution to a problem. So in law, we really see constructivist approaches emerge, where we want students to analyze a situation or analyze a particular scenario, and to devise a new law reform solution, as one example. Now, you might remember last week that I said that no one learning theory is better or more superior than another. They exist on a continuum, and they move from passive types of learning to more active types of learning. And the role of the teacher moves from one of teaching and imparting knowledge to facilitating learning and discovery. So their appropriateness really depends upon the desired learning objectives, and I'll say more about that in the next section. What I will say for now is that those more behaviourist and cognitivist approaches are useful for where we want our students to learn foundational concepts, whereas constructivist approaches are more suited to comprehending advanced subject matter. So the way that we design a learning environment is really shaped by the teacher's philosophy of learning and understanding of these educational theories. So you might be wondering, why do we need to worry about this? Well, it's important that we reflect as teachers on the nature of how our students learn, and that we use those theories to guide and construct meaningful learning experiences in the classroom. So it might mean that if we've decided to do a lengthy 2-hour lecture, when all we want to do is simply impart knowledge to students, that might not be the most effective method. So we want to start first by thinking about the theories of learning and what is it that our students want or need to get out of it. So let's now briefly demonstrate, and this is very experimental, so I'll have to ask you to bear with me. But what I'd like to do is demonstrate learning theory in action. And in some ways, it may be a completely unsuccessful example of totally misjudging learning theory, but we'll see how it goes. Now, I have determined as the educator that I would like you, as a result of this particular lesson that we have just had, to demonstrate an awareness of that knowledge that I have just imparted to you. So in particular, I would like you to demonstrate to me that you understand the learning theories that I have just told you about. So we're going to test that through a short quiz. So if you go over to the other browser that you have open, I'll ask you to, and you can do this either on the same device that you are on, or if you've got a second device, for example, a mobile phone, you could open up a browser there. And I want you to visit the website www.kahoot.it. So KAHOOT.it. Angelo, it might even be helpful to pop that link in the chat box if you don't mind. And when you get to that website, you'll be prompted to enter the game PIN, which is 9207408. So I'll just give you a moment to open up another browser and to do that. And in a second, I will share the quiz screen with you. I can see already that we have some people joining. Now, we've only got a short amount of time before we need to join. So I'll just open the screen share. Now, you should all be able to, I can see many of you joining, and you'll see the very strange auto-generated names that you've been given in the quiz. Don't worry so much about that. And very soon, we'll start the quiz. Angelo, can you just confirm you can see the Kahoot page from my screen share?
Yes, very visible, very clear.
Wonderful, great. I might even see if we can get some of the music.
Okay.
Just to set the tone. Okay, only a few seconds left and we're going into our quiz. Now, it's really important that you're ready to click the correct answer. Every time someone else joins, it does give a little bit of extra time. Now, as I said, this is very experimental. We'll have to see how it goes. But hopefully you'll be able to recall some of the things that I just mentioned to you. And we're off in 3, 2, 1. Get ready, everybody. Okay, so what is constructivism? So if lots of people got that right, you might need to do a little more revision. Okay, our next question is coming up. Which learning theory holds that learning occurs through the internal processing of information? Okay, well done, everybody. Next question is coming up. I don't know who Brave Hair is, but you're doing very well. Last couple of questions coming up now. Okay, everyone, and we have one final question coming up now. Okay. So that is our quiz in action, and congratulations to everyone for participating in what is a very difficult thing to do under such an environment where you haven't been given as much information perhaps as you would have ordinarily liked to have participated in such an activity. Angelo, can I just confirm that we have returned back to the PowerPoint slides?
Yes, you are, Amanda.
Jojo, I'm not sure about a prize. I don't know. Do we have the ability to award a prize? Thank you, everyone, for participating. Now, as I said, that's somewhat of an artificial demonstration in that you were given very limited stimulus there as a learner, and you were asked to recall very complex information quite quickly in a time-sensitive scenario. So hopefully you can see that you were given, however, very instantaneous feedback about your memory recall. A correct answer confirmed that you learned the information. If you were the first to respond, then you obviously had that information in deep. An incorrect answer suggested that you might need more time to learn that material. So that shows you something that might be possible as an educator if that was the kind of content that you wanted students to be able to recall. But you can see, however, that a quiz might be suitable for some learning concepts, but not all. All a quiz is testing is whether you can recall things like basic names or definitions. It doesn't really test whether you've mastered a thorough understanding of them. So if I had instead wanted you to demonstrate a comprehensive understanding of these concepts, a quiz would not be a particularly effective way of assessing your learning. So coming back to the theories of learning, if you were previously aware of them or not, all teachers approach their teaching in a way that is underpinned by at least one and potentially multiple of these theories of learning. So when we choose a particular way to teach, it's important to be aware that it has consequences for how people learn. If we choose to just give pop quizzes all the time, we're not fostering that deep understanding and learning that students need. But these sorts of tools do have their place. They can certainly break things up. They can help with encouraging an awareness of certain basic concepts. So I'm giving you the information about these theories of learning to encourage you to have that awareness that their role is to understand how our students learn and to make sure that our teaching is relevant and aligned to the needs of our audience. So we can therefore make better choices as teachers about the learning activities that we design. Does anyone have any questions at this point in time? What we might do, and do feel free again to use the raise hand function or to pop something in the chat, we might move on to consider now the concept of constructive alignment, because it flows from this idea of learning theories. Now, constructive alignment is an approach that underpins course design, and it speaks very much to this idea of constructivism, the third learning theory that I just told you about. And what it really is centered upon is this idea that we need to start with the outcomes that we want students to learn, and then we should align our teaching and assessment to those outcomes. So in very simple terms, and where constructive alignment first came from, was an educator, an Australian educator, who recognised that it seemed quite silly to issue a final exam to future school teachers, so students who are training to become teachers, and their final assessment was an exam. And all they were doing in that exam was basically repeating back to him what he had told them about applying psychology to education. So rather than telling him the same information that he had told them in the first place, it seemed far more appropriate to give them an opportunity to demonstrate their knowledge and to show how they would apply educational psychology. So he asked them, instead of doing an exam, to develop a comprehensive teaching portfolio instead. And so that's Biggs, who you see mentioned on the slide there. So a constructive alignment approach recognises that knowledge is constructed through the activities of the learner. It's not just transferred from the teacher to the student. Learning takes place through the active behaviour of the student. It's what they do, not what the teacher does. So we achieve alignment, constructive alignment in our teaching, when the learning activities that we ask students to engage in helps them to develop the knowledge, the skills, and the understanding that they need to complete the assessment tasks that we ultimately set. So the approach recognises, and at the very heart of the approach is the idea that assessment drives student learning. If the assessment is aligned with our intentions, then students are more likely to achieve the desired outcomes. Now, you might remember last week when we were focused particularly on technology, and I mentioned that sometimes, but particularly in the wake of the COVID pandemic, we often started by talking about how we were going to teach, and in the case of post-COVID, we started with the position that we would be teaching online, basically replicating what we did in the face-to-face classroom. So in other words, we simply assumed that synchronous live Zoom classes were the best way to teach our students. Or in face-to-face teaching, we might assume that a 2-hour lecture, or perhaps a particular resource, or maybe a certain textbook is the best starting point. But that is very much an approach that we would say is encapsulated by the idiom of putting the cart before the horse. In other words, we need to take a step back and to think first about what it is that we want our students to learn. In other words, the end point. What is it that we want the students to learn? And then design our teaching in ways that optimize their chances of achieving those learning outcomes. Rather than starting first with an assumption that a lecture is the best way to teach students, or that a certain resource, a certain textbook is the main thing that they should be using. So we have to reverse potentially an approach that we've been conditioned to do over time. And I've certainly made this observation last week, and I'll say it again later on in this session. Typically for us as legal educators, we tend to uncritically emulate or copy what it is that we experienced as law students ourselves. We tend to do the same things, we run the same approaches, but that might not necessarily be the most effective way of ensuring students are learning. So we need to stop putting the cart before the horse, and we need to take a step back and think first about what it is that we want students to learn. So that's what constructive alignment is really concerned with. So if we take a look at the constructive alignment approach, and this diagram that's taken from the website on the slide, which you'll be able to access after the session. separates that constructive alignment approach into a number of phases. And you can see that we start, first of all, with our course level learning outcomes. So our course level learning outcomes is really at the level of the entire law degree. So what is it that students need to be able to do as a result of undertaking a law degree? So often we'll have those learning outcomes stated at the course level. Often for law, it's very typical to see a learning outcome that a law graduate will possess a body of knowledge of substantive law. Or it might include that they have legal research skills or effective communication skills. So they're very high level outcomes. We need to then align our unit level or our subject level learning outcomes with achieving whatever it is that our course learning outcomes stipulate. So we need to look for ways to align that. Then we need to work out at the unit level or the subject level what it is that our students need to know in our substantive subject area. So if we're talking about environmental law, what is it that students in the Philippines need to know about environmental law? What are the key things that they must be able to demonstrate? Once we've then figured out what it is they need to know, then we can figure out how are we going to assess that knowledge, and then we can develop appropriate learning activities that will enable us to measure knowledge and provide students a way of learning what they need to know in order to demonstrate that through assessment tasks. So over the next little while, we're going to focus on these elements in particular. First of all, our learning outcomes, then our assessment tasks, and then our learning activities and resources. So let's move first to look at learning outcomes. Learning outcomes can be very basically stated as a statement of what a learner is expected to know or to understand or to be able to demonstrate after they have completed a process of learning. And it really reflects a student-centered rather than a teacher-centered approach. So in other words, we're not concerned with how we're going to teach them yet. We need to figure out first what it is they need to know. Remember, we're not putting the cart before the horse. So learning outcomes are very much then the foundation upon which the rest of our subject or our unit is built. Assessment tasks come later. They measure if those learning outcomes have been achieved. And then we worry about the learning activities after that. How do we need to teach students so that they can undertake the assessment tasks that we've set that will be necessary to demonstrate that they have achieved learning outcomes? And at the end of the line, what resources are going to be helpful or necessary to provide to students to support them? Now, in recent years, there has been a much greater focus on learning outcomes, and that's represented that shift from a student-centered approach, where a common practice was to simply design courses starting from what the content was that the teacher had to deliver within a particular time frame. Thank you, Gladys, for mentioning that about my mic. I'll try and be mindful. Now, learning outcomes have the potential to improve course design, and they do that by increasing the transparency for students and stakeholders by very much clarifying expectations around student performance. So this brings us then to the task of actually writing out learning outcomes. And I'm sure many of you have had experience with writing learning outcomes, what it is that you want your students to know and to achieve through the unit. Learning outcome statements usually contain a learning activity, a verb, that students need to perform in order to achieve the outcome. For example, they may need to apply the law to a given set of facts or explain a concept. The verb says what the relevant learning activities are that the students need to undertake in order to attain their intended learning outcomes. So learning is therefore constructed after that by the activities that students carry out. In other words, learning is about what they do, not what we do as teachers. So where can we go to get some guidance as to developing learning outcomes? Well, thankfully, there's been a lot of research about this over many, many years. And in particular, learning taxonomies are a type of classification that we can use to organise the skills, knowledge, values, and behaviours that teachers might aim to teach. So learning taxonomies can help us answer key questions on learning, teaching, and curriculum structure. What do we want students to learn? Why do we want them to learn that? How can we know that they're going to learn that? And the key benefit of using a taxonomy is that it provides that long list of verbs, those active words, those doing words that we can use to help us to design a learning outcome. And so you can see on the slide there, this is the most well-known taxonomy, and it was developed by Bloom in the 1950s. And it's really still the go-to for developing those learning outcomes. But there are many others out there. And if you delve into some of the research, you will see others that are relevant. So when you are designing a learning outcome, you need to think about what it is that students should be able to do or know upon successful completion of a course. What are the main skills or attributes or knowledge that they need? So it helps often to start with a very clear statement. On completion of this course, students should be able to recall, explain, apply, organise, appraise, evaluate, and so on. So what we're going to do now is have another little interactive activity, not a quiz this time. I'm going to take it to the next level, and there might be a bonus prize if someone can name the relevant learning theory here. I'm offering prizes, but I actually don't know if we have the capacity to do that. In the chat box, I've just, sorry, that's just been sent to only Gladys. I'll make sure I send that to everybody. I've just sent another link in the chat box there, and that will take you to another Padlet. So Padlet is the same app that we used earlier when we had the map of where everybody would like to visit. So if you open up a Padlet, the link that I've just given you, you'll see again, you have the same function where you can click on the pink plus sign and add in a learning outcome that perhaps you might think is relevant in environmental law. And so what I've done is I've included a few that, that might get you started. For example, the first one on the screen there is to identify relevant environmental laws and explain how the law is applicable to an environmental problem. Now, this is obviously a very much akin to the understanding level on Bloom's taxonomy there. It's a lower level learning outcome, and it's really aimed at just getting the students to identify and maybe explain. So we're getting more into some of the cognitivist approaches there. You can contrast that with the second one in the list, which asks students to evaluate laws against procedural and substantive criteria. So this is where we're getting more into the higher level learning or constructivist approaches. In much the same way, the other sample one there, to critically analyse environmental laws within various contexts. So when we're asking students or suggesting that a learning outcome is that they critically analyse something, we're really getting to the top end there of Bloom's taxonomy, the pyramid that's on your slide. And you can see that at that end, we're really getting into those deeper, more fundamental types of learning that ask students to evaluate and interrogate and really get into learning. Now, thank you to we've had one participant already insert a sample learning outcome, and that is to evaluate the environmental code of Butuan City. So that's a great example of a learning outcome. It uses evaluate. So we're looking here at a very higher level learning outcome there. Students would be encouraged by that to justify a position or a decision. And they're being asked to evaluate a very specific instrument there. So that, to my end, to my way of thinking, that's a very clear learning outcome. Some other ones that are popping up on the screen: to formulate and design legal remedies to address a variety of scenarios where environmental rights are abused. Again, we're seeing that language, formulate, design. So we're moving into that, that constructivist and also cognitivist, but also constructivist theories of learning, where we're asking students to come up with, to even produce new novel approaches to legal problems. So I'm going to leave that Padlet open, and I encourage you to use this as a resource. It's a resource where you can put your own suggested learning outcomes there, but you can also see the option to comment on the learning outcomes that have been suggested by others. Feel free to make suggestions of different wording that could be appropriate. And I'll certainly be visiting that site later on to provide extra feedback and comments on some of the proposed learning outcomes. So thank you for participating and including some of your suggested learning outcomes. It's really about playing with that language, those verbs in particular, taking your guidance from things like Bloom's taxonomy that help you to really articulate what it is, what are the key things that we need students to know as a result of undertaking this study. So remember, this is our starting point. If we're doing a constructive alignment approach, we start first by designing our learning outcomes. We don't start by saying, well, we're teaching online and we're going to do Zoom lectures, or we're teaching through a seminar and we'll have weekly pop quizzes. That comes much later on in the process. Does anyone have any questions at this point in time? As I said, I will leave that Padlet open and you can come back and access that at any time. And I encourage you to use this as a platform where, as a community of scholars, you can come together and share resources with one another and to help one another with different approaches that you might use at your respective institutions. So let's keep moving because we've only just scratched the surface. Once we have designed our learning outcomes, we then turn our attention to the assessment methods that are going to be used to assess the learning outcomes. And assessment is all about deciding or assessing how well students have achieved intended outcomes. In other words, it's not about how well they report back to us what we have told them or what they have read. It's about how they achieve those learning outcomes that we have set. So assessment provides that opportunity for students to demonstrate how well they've achieved learning outcomes. You may have heard reference before to the idea of criterion referenced assessment. Now, criterion referenced assessment makes it very clear that what the standards of achievement are and allow for very clear and transparent judgment of student attainment of learning outcomes against a predetermined set of indicators or criteria. So up front, we tell students, we provide them with information about the qualities or the characteristics that will be used to measure how well they've achieved learning outcomes. What will be taken into account in judging their performance. So there are therefore some particular considerations that we might keep in mind when we're designing assessment. First of all, is the task authentic and situated in the real world? Would it stand in its own right as a worthwhile learning activity? And does it prompt the student to develop their own sense of judgment that they can draw upon in the future after they've left our subject and when they're faced with these scenarios in real life? Ultimately, though, it's all about aligning that assessment task with the desired learning outcome that we want students to achieve. Now, assessment tasks come in a variety of forms, as I'm sure you're all aware. Assessment tasks can be summative, which is where we would assign a grade or a mark at the end of a semester or a teaching period to indicate the extent to which students have achieved learning outcomes. Or they may be formative, which is where we provide feedback to aid learning along the way. Now, these don't necessarily have to be used to grade students. We might just be seeking to give them some feedback, but formative assessment can also be summative as well. And a good example of that is if we give students a mid-semester or a mid-term assignment that counts perhaps for a portion of their final grade, but also provides an opportunity for them to receive feedback along the way. So formative versus summative assessment, remember that an assessment task can actually do both functions. When we come to our types of assessment, historically, and many of you may recall this from your own time as a law student, and I'm sure I heard Matthew say this previously, that in his time at Sydney University, it was all closed book end of semester exams. And historically, that's what many law schools have done. A 3-hour exam or perhaps longer at the end of semester, do or die, 100% exam with no feedback or very limited opportunities for feedback, and certainly no opportunity for a student to rectify and remediate once that feedback is received. Now, that approach reflects the Langdellian approach from Harvard, but, and I can see Matthew's comment now, completely closed book, maybe with an essay in the 1980s. Now, I'm pleased to say that many law schools have obviously moved on from that position and are returning back to certainly the approaches that were in place in, say, for example, England up to the 17th century, where examination of law students was conducted very much in a practical sense, where students put forward vivas and very active summaries of cases and put forward how they might argue a particular case in court. So we're starting to see a return to those methods of assessment, and we have done over the last 20 years or so. Now, you will be familiar with various types of assessment. Of course, you will be aware of things like essays, hypotheticals, where students have to apply the law to a set of facts, whether we give that to them in an essay, or perhaps we might assign that as a presentation that they do. We have, of course, multiple choice quizzes, and you've all had an experience with that here today. We can use audience response systems and polling within classes to check for understanding of content. Things like Mentimeter are another form of formative assessment, which we may or may not attribute a mark to. We have oral advocacy, where students must present a particular side of a case. We have law reform submissions, research briefs. The list is endless, and we would be here for hours if I were to go through a catalogue of all the different types of assessment. The main point is, for you to take away from this, is to ensure that whatever your assessment task is, that you're providing students an opportunity to demonstrate achievement of learning outcomes. So to that end, there is very little point in setting students a quiz as an assessment task if you have set a learning outcome, for example, and I'm borrowing straight off one of the ones that's been put in here, if your learning outcome is to draft an environmental code for a local government unit in coastal areas, there's no point setting a quiz as a summative assessment for that kind of learning. A quiz may certainly be helpful in a formative capacity there to scaffold and build the learning, but it's probably not going to be an appropriate learning activity for that level of depth of what you're seeking the students to actually learn. I've just noticed that we have a comment here that from Abelardo that Matthew's comment is still endemic in the Philippine law teaching community. That's a really helpful insight. Thank you for passing that on. And it's still good training for passing the bar. So that seems to me, or that suggests to me, that perhaps the approach in the Philippines is much more aligned with a summative only or largely summative approach, where we have an end of semester assessment task without opportunities for formative development leading up to that final assessment. So that means, and sometimes we don't have a lot of control over that too. I should acknowledge that point. Certainly, I know here in Australia, in some cases, not so much now, but previously, admitting bodies, bar associations and so on, would control the nature of assessment that had to be applied for final assessment for students. Now, even where that is the case, it doesn't mean that we can't provide opportunities for students to access formative opportunities for learning and to receive feedback along the way, even if it doesn't attract any summative weighting, any marks towards their final assessment. So I think, I guess what I am encouraging you here to think about is to challenge, I guess, some of these traditional assumptions that have underpinned how we teach law, and to think very particularly about those learning outcomes. We often come in where we do think about learning outcomes with very lofty goals for what we want our students to learn and to take away from a subject. And then we end up providing assessment opportunities that are not aligned with those learning outcomes, or don't provide students with the opportunity to achieve those aims. So I can see in the sample learning outcomes list that we're amassing here some very aspirational and high-level goals that we want our learners to achieve. But how can we get them to do that? And I would issue you that challenge to say that perhaps giving students a final exam as the only method of assessment, or a traditional written essay, is probably not really going to activate the sorts of creativity that we would want for students to achieve those higher level learning goals. Now, we could, of course, spend an entire session on designing assessment tasks. And I know already in your network, you have access to leaders in your community, people like Rose Lisa, who we heard from last week, and attorney Donna, who generously shared some of their approaches to not only to learning activities, but to assessment as well. I would encourage you to look for opportunities to share different assessment tasks with one another. And especially if you've been doing the same thing for some time, is it time for you to question perhaps how you assess students, or whether your assessment tasks are truly aligned with those learning outcomes? So again, what I would encourage you to do is to go back into that learning outcome Padlet. You can do it now, or you can take time after the session today. Maybe in the comments under some of the learning outcomes, provide some suggestions as to how you might go about assessing that particular learning outcome. Is an exam, closed book, the best way to assess students? Could you impose, for example, a verbal presentation, a policy research brief, and so on? So again, the opportunities are endless. You're only limited by your own creativity. So think big when it comes to looking for ways that you could otherwise provide students with an opportunity to assess and to demonstrate what it is that they have gained from your class. And this is probably an appropriate time to mention the IUCN Academy of Environmental Law, which Rose Lisa, of course, is the chair of. That is a global community of scholars who are interested in environmental law, but particularly environmental law teaching. And every year at the annual colloquium, there is a particular panel on teaching in environmental law, where you get to hear some wonderful examples from around the world as to how different scholars are requiring their students to demonstrate their attainment of learning outcomes. And I've seen some fantastic examples, for example, giving students the opportunity to prepare a documentary on a particular piece of legislation and how it could be reformed. There are so many ways that we can encourage our students to be passionate and to engage with those very aspirational and lofty learning outcomes that we have. We are not far away from our break, but what I'd like to do briefly before we pause is to just cover off one final topic, and that is learning activities. Now, again, this is one of those topics that we could probably sit here and talk about all day. Once you have designed your learning outcomes and your assessment tasks that will ideally measure student achievement of learning outcomes, the next step in developing your unit or your subject, whatever terminology you use, is to consider the learning activities that learners will participate in or complete. And they will participate in and complete those learning activities to help them develop the skills, the knowledge, and the understanding that we've identified in the learning outcomes. And it will be assessed through the assessment tasks. So this is where we get to the point of designing the learning experience. And now we start to get into thinking about the methods that we're going to use to teach our students. And of course, we spent some time talking about this last week in the context of the online environment. What I will say from the outset is that there is no correct way, there is no right learning activity in law. There is no evidence to suggest that Socratic methodology, that is a lengthy lecture where you pepper rapid fire questions at students to recall certain case facts or to cite principles. There is no definitive research to say that that is the best method of teaching or learning in law. Ideally, it needs to be based upon a combination of the strategies that suit your individual teaching style, but also the learning needs of your learners. And ultimately, that's a question of what is going to help them to develop the skills to demonstrate achievement of the learning outcomes. So when we come back to that idea of constructive alignment, if we want students to develop, for example, oral communication skills that they might use as an advocate, and yet we give them no opportunities through either assessment or through our learning activities to practice and demonstrate those oral communication skills, then we have not achieved that constructive alignment. So it's important for all of those factors to line up. Now, of course, this will also require an assessment of what tools you have available to you. So that, of course, will depend upon your cohort and their needs. And sometimes you have to select the most appropriate delivery method. For example, if there is a global pandemic and you can't go to campus, then you may have to rely on online technology in order to teach. But as we discussed last week, there is no one-size-fits-all design, and there's no requirement, for example, that you would use online teaching in a way that seeks to emulate the practice that we would do on campus. So the best approach is to use that combination of strategies that suits the teaching style of your own teaching style, the learning needs of learners, and what is going to maximize their ability to achieve learning outcomes. So in the chat box, I'm going to now place a link to another Padlet. And again, I encourage you to use this as a community of practice where you can share approaches that have worked either for yourself or perhaps you've observed others do. And we are, of course, approaching in a few minutes' time our 5-minute wellness break, but I will leave this Padlet open over the break and beyond for you to all come in if you like and share your own approaches and thoughts. So again, in law, there has traditionally been and historically has been a preference for lengthy lectures, in some cases supported by tutorials, but we know from research, and if we're honest completely with our own experience, and I realise now that I am getting to that point where I have probably maximised your attention span, we know that student attention wanes after about 15 to 20 minutes. And it's particularly more so in the online environment where students are fighting with competing distractions, emails popping up or other apps that are online, as well as the cognitive load of being at the other end of a screen. Research tells us that it's much more demanding than being in a face-to-face environment where we can take our cues from the body language of people in the room. For example, at the moment, I'm staring at a list of 93 other participants, none of whom have a camera on, as far as I can see on my screen. So I have no idea how this content is being received at the other end. So that cognitive load for teachers and students is very much increased in that online environment. So I encourage you now to come into that Padlet as we pause in a few moments for our break and to add some of your own experiences. I'm not discouraging you from using content-focused methods. So for example, there is nothing wrong with a 2-hour face-to-face lecture if that is the most appropriate activity for achieving the learning outcomes that you have set. But there are ways to use that modality effectively. For example, you can break content up into smaller chunks. In the physical classroom setting, you might provide information and then you'll stop after a short period of time and then ask students to respond to a related question. Or in the online environment, you may not use a 2-hour lecture. Instead, you could look at using software such as Microsoft Sway or other presentation platforms to deliver content in smaller chunks, again, interspersed with questions or other interactive activities where students can pause and reflect on their knowledge. And so to that end, I'm now going to provide you with an opportunity to pause and reflect on your learning so far, and to also take a wellness break for the next 5 minutes.
All right, thank you, Prof. Amanda, for that very substantive lecture on theories, outcomes, and learnings for activities, and a very engaging and fun way of assessing learning also. Maybe next time we can reserve something for the prize. All right, so before we give our participants some time to rest, we will be having our 5-minute break, as said by Professor Amanda. But we would like to remind everyone to fill out their attendance sheets and evaluation form after today's session. We would also like to invite everyone to join the Envilo Asia FB group developed by our partner ADB through their TTT training program. The FP group is a closed group for environmental law lecturers and advocates, and it aims to strengthen the capacity and networks for environmental law. To join, just click join and the page admin will grant your request. All right, so we will be having our 5-minute break. Please be back at 10:16 a.m. Thank you.
Welcome back, everybody. I'd just like to confirm, Mary, that you can see the correct slides again and that the sound is working from my end.
Yes, Amanda, loud and clear, and we can see your slide on learning activities.
Wonderful, thank you. So that's where we paused just before the break, and I do hope that you were able to take a moment to refresh and perhaps grab a drink or something to eat as we now move into our second hour, and there will be plenty of time towards the end for questions and for further exploring of issues. So I just wanted to just once again emphasize that learning activities, there is a link on the slide there, but of course in the chat box we shared just before the break to the second Padlet, which is around learning activities in law. And I can see through the break there have been some comments added in there, so thank you to those of you who have done so. Again, just encouraging you to share your examples and your experiences with learning activities that can work. So as I said before the break, I wanted to hand over to you because I know that many of you are already using or you have seen what is being used by others. And so keep those options open, keep learning from and hearing from your colleagues to see who else is really doing good things when it comes to teaching approaches and learning activities in law. As I said, we could spend a lot of time going through each of the different methods, but we don't have time in a short program such as what we have today. So what I'd like to now do is to move on to looking at the issue of learning environments. So what do we mean when we talk about learning environments? Well, learning environments very much incorporates our overall educational approach, whether it's student or teacher-centered, but hopefully after what I've just covered with you, you would be looking more at a student-centered approach. It takes into account our student characteristics. Are we dealing with first-year students? Are we dealing with final-year students? Are we dealing with non-school leavers or so-called mature age students who perhaps have a different motivation for learning law? What is the cultural context of our learners? Is there a physical or virtual presence to their learning? So again, just to emphasize, there is no formula, there is no single way of creating an effective learning environment in law. But what we do need to be aware of, particularly if we are adopting a constructivist approach, is that our learning environments can extend beyond the classroom. And I'm referring here to both physical classrooms, but also online classrooms. Learning environments expand beyond these settings, and they can draw on the expertise of not only the teacher, but other experts. They can draw on student experiences in the workplace, and they can also draw upon peer approaches to learning as well. So don't discount any of those influences on the learning of your students. So the learning environment is the overall setting in which learning takes place. It takes into account the learning outcomes that we have set for our students, the methods of assessment, the teaching approaches, and all of those other contextual settings that give rise to the effectiveness or otherwise of learning of our students. So let's delve a little bit deeper. And a hot topic that we constantly hear of, and I know this was a topic of conversation last week, is the issue of student engagement. And it's a key challenge in all learning environments, but I would suggest to you it's particularly challenging in the online setting to try and engage students. And we've certainly seen the constraints here, even in today's session, of trying to interact and to have a level of engagement, particularly when we have such constraints as bandwidth, or as we saw earlier in the chat, one of our colleagues is in a quarantine facility at the moment and is not able to access dual browsers. So that constrains the ability to which they have been able to participate. And so we know that engagement can be hampered or restricted by all of these contextual factors. So that's why we need to take stock of our overall learning environment. But we know that with online learning, particularly, that engagement is a lot trickier to achieve. But that being said, it's not impossible to do so. Now, there's been a lot of research into what is called the community of inquiry model, which really gets into this idea of what the educational experience and that learning environment is all about. And the community of inquiry model, which the citation is on the slide that is provided, but you will be able to access this later if you don't catch it now. This is from Garrison, Anderson and Archer's research. They have put forward this community of inquiry model. And through that model, they suggest that the most significant variable in teaching and learning satisfaction is presence. What is presence? Well, presence is simply being there. But they tell us that presence comes in a number of forms. First of all, we have cognitive presence. Cognitive presence refers to how we facilitate the critical thinking from which students construct and confirm meaning. Social presence, on the other hand, is the extent to which participants identify within their community and the ability for them to develop interpersonal relationships or to project themselves as social and emotional beings, real people. And finally, teacher presence refers to the design and the management of those cognitive and social presence factors and how they go around realizing and facilitating learning outcomes. Deep learning happens when all three of these elements interact, as we can see in the middle of the Venn diagram that's on the slide. So let's look a little bit more at these different types of presence. Cognitive presence has been defined as the extent to which the professor and the students are able to construct and confirm meaning through sustained discourse or discussion in a community of inquiry. So in other words, to what extent beyond that initial provision of information are students able to interact with learning materials and with content and with you as a professor to understand the material that has been put to them, to understand the learning that they need to do. So in some ways, cognitive presence is akin to social presence, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But rather than connecting over personal characteristics, it's about fostering connections over the ideas and the thoughts and the beliefs about the subject matter. So one way of actually activating cognitive presence among your students is to ask them very early on, what are your learning goals for this particular subject or for the course? It also assists in building social connections, again, which I'll talk to in a moment, but it really assists students to be able to engage with and to embrace the content of the unit or the subject. So cognitive presence goes beyond just the content of the unit. It connects the content of the unit or the subject to broader meaning and depth. Tending to cognitive presence and paying attention to cognitive presence takes time on the part of the professor. You need to listen, you need to reflect, and you need to respond to your students to encourage that sustained conversation about why they are interested in the subject matter. But the great news is that for environmental law, that is certainly a lot easier to achieve, in my view, than it is to try and achieve the same sort of cognitive investment in something like equity and trusts. And any apologies to colleagues here that perhaps teach into that subject area. But in my view, environmental law is an area where we can really invoke passion from our students. And we heard this in the video at the beginning of the session from our colleagues, your leaders in the Philippines, who demonstrate through every day the passion that they have for the subject matter. So cognitive presence allows us as educators to demonstrate that interest in the content and to inspire the same interest in students. How do we connect what they're learning in the classroom with the realities that are experienced in the real world? Discussion forums, collaborative tools online, even face-to-face interactions all provide opportunities for us to build and foster that connection with cognitive presence. Now, let's reflect then a little more on the idea of social presence. Social presence, as I said a moment ago, is less about fostering connections over the content, but more about fostering connections on a personal level among the learners in the unit. And it's the extent to which those learners, as it says on the slide, can project themselves as real people and to connect with their peers. In the face-to-face setting, of course, we see how this happens through the very real personal friendships and conversations that our students have in the real world setting. Again, this is where we see the challenges in trying to do this and trying to achieve social presence in the online context. But we can do it. As you saw at the beginning, where we only had a few minutes of time, I gave you a small activity to go and to put into a map places that you might like to visit. And that's a way that you can build informally those connections within your cohort. There are so many ways that you can do that. And if you have a look online at things like icebreakers in class, but particularly if you search for something like online teaching icebreakers, you'll find a wealth of examples that you can also draw upon to help provide opportunities for social presence. In other words, for opportunities for students to identify with that community. There are other ways that you can provide those opportunities too within an online learning management system. You can encourage students to post news reports or items of interest. Ask them to post a video introduction of themselves. Have them introduce their family members or their pets. All of these are very small but very effective ways that we can situate learners within learning communities and learning environments. And they are potentially different, but by no means less effective, but they may be different to what you would experience in a face-to-face setting. Now, by far and away, the most effective way that we can engage students in learning environments is through ensuring that there is teacher presence. Time and time again, teacher presence, especially in the online teaching environment, has been shown to increase student engagement with content. So what do we mean by teacher presence? Well, again, it's the degree to which the teacher is visible in the classroom. So if that's a physical classroom, it's very easy to seem visible and to seem approachable for students to come and ask questions after class or to send you an email or to telephone you. In the online realm, it's about being seen through your learning management system. Again, you can do things like posting video introductions, sharing information about pets or your favorite hobbies or interests, but you can also connect with students in ways that show that you have an interest in their achievement and their success, and most importantly, their attainment of those learning outcomes that we have set at the outset. Posting discussion posts, addressing students by name, learning about their backgrounds, taking the time to do that, initiating and contributing to discussion threads, posting news reports. So in many ways, teacher presence combines and cuts across both cognitive presence and also social presence to ensure that instructor visibility and to demonstrate enthusiasm and interest in the subject content. Now, I've already said that environmental law, we're all here because we're passionate about this particular field of study. And it's often not very difficult once we start talking to demonstrate that passion that we have for our subject area. So I encourage you to channel that and bring that into the classroom, whether it's an in-person classroom or an online classroom, and to use that to fuel your interactions with students and to encourage and inspire them to meet those learning outcomes that we've already discussed. Teaching presence is very much manifested in the course materials and design. And it's in everything that the faculty member does to guide and support and to shape the experiences of the learners. So it's really important that we are infusing that throughout our course design and providing the mechanisms for us to be visible and to interact with our students. In other words, it goes beyond simply providing a course syllabus or appearing at a lecture on a regular basis and actually interacting with students. So when we're talking about a learning environment, it's those sorts of elements that go a long way to creating an effective learning environment where our learners have, as you can see on the Venn diagram there in the middle, where all of those three elements align. They have a positive educational experience that is supported by engaging discourse around the subject matter. It has a climate of collegiality and shared learning, and it's underpinned by appropriate content that has been selected to achieve certain learning outcomes. Now, we only have a few moments left before we're going to break for some question and answers. And I really want to give you the opportunity to ask questions and to share your experiences as well. The last topic that I want to talk to you about today is this idea of reflective practice. Now, again, some of you may well be already familiar with this. And as I said at the outset, simply being here today is an example of reflective practice, but it's something that as educators, it's important for us to pay attention to, because learning is not only a process, but teaching too is a process, and we must take the time to reflect on that process and to think about whether it is effective. In some ways, you can think about it as closing the loop. So we started by setting out our learning outcomes. We worked through that process of developing assessment and thinking about learning activities and selecting resources. This is the final point then, when we think about whether our approach has been effective. If it has, great. If it hasn't, what can you do to come back to that beginning point and refine your approach? So that's what reflective practice is all about. How do we learn from our teaching experiences to develop pedagogic skills and professional practice? So it's all about turning our experiences of teaching into learning. And there's a quote there on the slide that reflective practice is those intellectual and affective activities in which individuals engage to explore their experiences to lead to new understandings and appreciations. So reflective practice is, as I've just alluded to, very much a cycle. It's a cycle of reflection, action, and reflection again in a continuous process of self-evaluation. It might occur on an informal level, and it might occur on an informal individual level as a form of introspection after a class. What did I do well? What could I have done better? Or it can be more structured. It can be a peer review where you ask one of your colleagues to come and sit in on a class and review your teaching approach. Or it could be through the production of a more detailed teaching portfolio that somebody else assesses. And it can be focused on a range of experiences and activities. It could be, for example, that you ask a peer to review your learning management site if you're using online teaching. Or you might want someone to just sit on one particular lecture and to assess how you go about teaching in that environment. So there are a couple of different models of reflection that I just want to highlight to you. First of all, we have reflection in anticipation. So we start reflecting before we even go into the environment, the learning environment. What do we bring to our teaching activities? What are our expectations and goals? What do we think the students will do with the material that we give them? And what are our assumptions? So, for example, in setting the Kahoot quiz earlier today, I had to think about things like, what's my technical capacity to run an activity like that? Is Angelo on the other end of the line, as thankfully he often is, to help save me if we have some sort of technological disaster? Thanks, Angelo. So these are the sorts of reflections that we might take into us beforehand. What are my expectations? And sometimes we don't have a lot of control over that. For example, I wasn't sure the extent to which you as an audience had experienced that technology. It may be that you give me feedback that you found that activity really boring and that you'd like to not do that again. And that's okay. I can reflect on that, take that on board and adjust my approach for next time. We can also reflect in the midst of action. What have we noticed about an activity as it is unfolding and what decisions are being made? Now, that's a very easy task to undertake in a physical classroom where we can look at our students' body language. We can see how many are asleep in the back row and how we might need to adjust our approach. It's a lot trickier to do in an online environment. As I said before, when you have 92 cameras turned off, absolutely necessary to preserve bandwidth, but it doesn't give you an instant feedback loop that you can use to adjust your approach as you are proceeding. So you may need to look for other ways to derive that reflection. You might have to ask for comments or for feedback from your peers. And finally, there is a reflection process that you can engage in after the event. How did the activity play out? What were our feelings or emotions about that particular type of teaching? What decisions were made in the classroom and why? So reflection in action and reflection in anticipation is typically very private, very fast, very intuitive, and it's something that you get more experienced with the longer you have been teaching. So much so we don't often realize that we're doing it. For example, how many times have you been in a classroom where you've adjusted your approach because you see the interactions that you're receiving from your students? So that quick thinking and that flexibility is an essential tool for a teacher, and it's something that we can work to develop as part of being a reflective practitioner. Reflection after events happens afterwards. It can be individual, but it's often very helpful if we can also do it in a collegial way where we can draw upon the perspectives of our colleagues and their thoughts and approaches on teaching. So a very simple way to approach reflective practice is to think about what went well today and why. What skills and abilities did I bring to the class? What were my expectations for the class and were they met? What could have been better and why? What skills and abilities do I want to develop as a teacher, and how can I extend myself? And do I have any biases that I need to note as a teacher and adjust my approach accordingly? Now, we're coming up almost to time. And so what I would encourage you to think about in terms of a parting summary is to just share, I guess, my experience. And that is to say that I started my career as a law teacher with no instruction on teaching or assessment methods or learning outcomes or anything like that. And I expect and I anticipate that for many of you, your experience has probably been the same. So what do? We tend to revert to emulating what we felt like were good approaches that we saw in our own lecturers and our own professors. And we tend to steer away from those learning experiences that we didn't get much out of. Law school teachers, law school academics, typically do not receive a lot of instruction on how to craft assessment, how to craft learning, how to craft learning outcomes. So we teach in much the same way that we were taught, and we tend to assess in much the same way that we were taught. And it wasn't until I undertook further study, a graduate certificate in law teaching, that I was able to see, I guess, this different picture of what teaching could in fact be like. Now, I'm not suggesting by any means that you need to undertake that further study, but I guess my challenge to you is to be open to challenging your own assumptions about what is good teaching in law and what is good teaching in environmental law in particular, and to be open to learning from others and to be open to expanding different methods that you might try, different ways that you might approach learning. So that was a very fast tour through the pedagogy and the methodology and a tiny little bit of the best practice of teaching and learning in environmental law. So what I'd like to do now is to hand over to Matthew, who I believe will moderate the question and answer session. So there'll be an opportunity now for you to ask questions and for us to continue the conversation. But of course, as I've said before, I've left those Padlets live and I can see there's lots of comments going on, which is fantastic. So please continue to use those resources as well. Matthew, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Amanda and Mary. Thank you. So we have now some time for questions and answers. And we already have one question from Commissioner Jojo, which is about what are the higher education institutions that have graduate certification in law teaching?
Well, that's a great question. Unfortunately, I don't, my apologies that I'm looking all over the place here. I'm just trying to align my screens back up again now that I've stopped screen sharing. Unfortunately, the qualification that I studied that was a graduate certificate in law teaching, that was through Monash University in Australia. My understanding is that that qualification is no longer taught. So it was a very specific qualification, as I'm sure you can imagine. The desire for a grad cert in law teaching is not something that every academic would like. But many other institutions offer a similar degree, which is a graduate certificate in higher education. So that's a quite separate one. Either way, I obviously experienced the qualification specific to law teaching, but I think you can obtain just as well rounded experience by undertaking a graduate certificate in higher education. And I agree with Commissioner Jojo's comment there that, that such a certification is valuable. And it's valuable not only for law academics, but for academics across the spectrum, because we tend to assume that if someone is good at researching in a particular area or practicing law in a particular area, they're also going to be great at teaching, and that doesn't always necessarily work out. Sometimes we do need education and training around what is good teaching, what is good pedagogy, what is good practice.
So can I just follow up there in terms of, I mean, it's always struck me that a number of these activities require, time to be spent by the academic, and academics are often time poor because they've got a lot of obligations. So I was wondering, do you have any thoughts about how academics can come together to try and reduce some of this time that's spent? And maybe also you could reference the work that you do with the IUCN Academy of Environmental Law.
Sure. So again, I can probably talk from experience through not only the Academy, but here in Australia. And if such an institution is not yet established in the Philippines, it would be something I would probably encourage. So at the international level, I mentioned earlier the IUCN Academy of Environmental Law. So within the Academy, which is that global network of scholars who do research and work within environmental law, there is a particular committee that is focused entirely on teaching and capacity building, and specifically on improving teaching practice. So that's a great network that you can interact with. You can find mentors and other sources of support and advice. Also, the Developing Environmental Law Champions program, which sort of steps out of the Academy, is another great network that has been built. And I know Angelo may even be, if he's quick enough, may even be able to put the link in the chat box there. The Developing Environmental Law Champions website actually has profiles on there of a range of scholars from around the globe that you can interact with, who may be in your area of expertise or who are in your region or your country. And you can use that as a way to approach others who may wish to share good practice. The other thing I would recommend is a more local regional network of environmental law teachers. So here in Australia, we do have that each year. We have an annual event called the Frontiers of Environmental Law Conference, where academics come together to share not only substantive academic research, but also research on teaching and teaching practices. So it's very much an informal network, but one that is very robust, and one where there is a great spirit of collegiality and a willingness to share resources. So I can see now that Angelo is posting in the chat box some links to both the Environmental Law Champions database, but also to the Facebook group as well that you might like to interact with.
Thanks, Amanda. So if anyone has any questions, if they want to use the raise hand button in the reactions box to ask a question. And I think people are still using the Padlet, and that's obviously part of that idea of sharing. I know that one of the things that we often talk about is the community of practice, and that seems to be something that is sort of very relevant not only to environmental law teaching, but all academic teaching, because the transformation over the last sort of 5 years, I think, has been quite significant.
I think we're very good at establishing networks for particular research fields. It's not hard to find a group of scholars who may be interested in doing research on a particular area of work, whether it's human rights and the environment or so on. But I think I would also encourage the development of those networks around teaching practice as well, and sharing with one another, as we've done today through the Padlets. What does a good learning outcome look like? And I can see we've had some comments here about, a very interesting one. How does one develop an objective sense for reflective practice and self-assessment as teachers? That's a really good thing to ask, and it's something that you may want to reflect upon with other practitioners as well, and to share share experiences with others and to have them critique the approaches that you have made. So I think I would just be encouraging you to share those experiences. I think as teachers, we often don't invite others in, whereas our research is always out there for others to comment and critique upon. So I would encourage you to do the same with teaching practice.
So there is also a question from Com Jojo. So Commissioner, do you want to state your question or to come on?
Okay, I'll do it.
Because I look at and I just have to say, as someone who has spent 35 years in environmental law, I think and as a lawyer, both as a professional and also as a sort of an applied teacher, because I teach practical law, I think this is a really powerful motivating factor for students about passion and engagement, especially in this particular discipline of environmental law.
Yeah, because because Amanda and Matthew, I'm always uncomfortable. Like I feel like that is always in my mind that I should put as a learning outcome, because I could also feel it in my students that it should involve feelings. But when I look at Bloom's taxonomy, I couldn't see feeling there. But I'm in a course that is about passion. So I was saying, is it wrong for me? That's why I never placed that there. But always at the back of my mind, always informally, it's really part of the learning outcome to make my law students fall in love with taking care of the environment. But is falling in love, is feeling for the people whose environment has been destructed, really feel, because I always believe that learning is not just the brain. Learning involves the heart. And when the heart is there, learning becomes very effective. And I've seen this. I've seen this in my students who are now lawyers and are in government and are really passionate in doing things to protect the environment. But I have never placed it in my learning outcome in my syllabus because, to put in parentheses, I'm ashamed to acknowledge that feelings are part of learning, because I don't see that. Even in Bloom's taxonomy, where do I place feelings? But deep
No,
down
and I
inside.
think there's a comment in the chat that I think really hones in on the challenge there, which is how do you then link that back to assessment? How can you assess whether or not students have actually achieved that? There's no right or wrong answer to this. Sometimes we can be constrained through institutional limitations in terms of how we would articulate a learning outcome. But what I would suggest to you is that if you are looking in the space of trying to articulate a learning outcome around, perhaps feelings could be tricky, but if you're wanting to articulate a learning outcome in that broad space, looking further down the line, reflective learning activities are a great way of trying to gauge whether students have undertaken that reflection and that thought and concept. And I think the challenge then comes with, how do you assess reflection? And the temptation there is, of course, to reward students that have come to the same conclusion that we have about the environment. Now, it may well be the case that a student reflects and decides that that's not a valid concern for them. And so that's where we get into quite difficult territory. So it's about ensuring that they go through the process of reflection rather than what they end up with ultimately. Commissioner Jojo, there's no easy answer to that question. That's
I know. Thank you.
I'm going to dig around and see if I can find some resources where others have tried to articulate a learning outcome along those lines. I've certainly not encountered it, and I suspect the reason why is because people experience the same difficulties you have or butt up against challenges at the institutional level.
Thank you very much for that.
Thanks. We also have a question from Jelly Molino. Would you like? Thank you.
Good morning. Actually, it's not a question. It's actually a reply, because I was the one who made also a reply to the comment, because I understand the importance of feeling, in the sense that the real issue in terms of providing outcomes is to make it an objectable outcome. So of all the outcomes there, I really feel the importance of feeling. But the question is, how am I gonna write it in such a way that I will be providing a very specific outcome that my dean or supervisor will approve? Because we all know that when we propose a syllabus where the outcomes are there, we have some measurable indicators to make sure that this is very specific, and then there is no sense of emotion in it. I'm suggesting like to understand the challenges both by unregulated extractive activities, which I have to put an example, illegal mining, and to the affected indigenous communities. So which means that it is really very important for us in the education, environmental laws, particularly, to make sure that when we incorporate feelings, we have to make sure we do it in a very, the methodology, the right choice of words, so that it will be approved by our supervisors.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And also remember that even if it's not possible for it to be encapsulated in a learning outcome, that doesn't mean you still can't inspire passion and interest in your students. Remember back to our model of our community of inquiry and ensuring that we have presence. You know, you may be able to construct very objective learning outcomes, but extrapolate from that the sort of emotion and feelings that you want to engender in students through things like cognitive presence, connecting perhaps the very objective dry statute that you have to teach with the very emotional realities of what is happening in the real world. And so through that, you have a lever there to engage with students. Great observation though, thank you.
Yeah, and I thought, you know, an excellent observation, especially when dealing with Indigenous people and the law and natural resources law, is one of the things that, you know, we do learn from Indigenous people is their connectivity to the land is far more related to feelings than any economic, you know, analysis or benefit that might be created from the exploitation. I mean, that to me, and how one relates that in terms of that Bloom's taxonomy is quite interesting, is at the highest level in terms of how that is approached. But there's also one quick question I thought in terms of, you know, from Marianne Ray's love for the environment is often experiential and difficult to acquire in the classroom.
And I'm glad you highlighted that one, Matthew, because I was going to say, I realise we're at time, but with your indulgence, I would like to just comment on that great remark there from Marianne. Thank you. You are absolutely right, and no more have we felt that challenge over the past, well, gosh, what are we, almost at 2 years, where we've not really been able to get outside of a physical classroom, let alone get outside of an online classroom. The textbook that I put on the slide that you'll be provided the reference to, in the chapter there talking about online teaching, I actually think, again, that environmental law, we're quite lucky because it is a subject that does lend itself to creating that situated learning and simulating it in an online environment if we're prevented from getting to these places. And that's the case even in many other situations where we don't have a global pandemic. It's not possible to take a class of students in Australia to see deforestation in the Amazon, but we've got so many wonderful resources online. We have videos, we have mapping tools. You can even do a Google Earth flyover to give a sense of that sort of challenge that is faced in these environments. So again, I would encourage you in environmental law to look for those resources that really speak to the sorts of things that you need to convey to students, because there's so much out there and a really wonderful, rich assortment of materials.
Thank you, Amanda. And can I say thank you very much for the 2 hours. It really has flown in terms of the amount of ideas and thoughts. I know that every time I listen to you, I develop more approaches and ways of presenting and teaching and helping my students to really learn. So thank you very much. I'm now going to turn over to Mary. But can I also ask everyone to, yes, raise your clapping hands to thank Amanda for her presentation. Can I also say we are looking at sourcing copies of that textbook that Amanda and the IUCN Academy of Environmental Law has provided. So we're hoping that we can provide a copy to everyone because there's a lot of really great material there as part of that ongoing journey of being a good teacher. So thank you, Amanda, as always, and Mary, over back to you.
Thank you, Professor Amanda and Matthew. To express our feelings of gratitude to Professor Amanda in her support to our training program, we would like to present the Certificate of Appreciation to Professor Amanda Kennedy, Law Professor, Faculty of Law, Queensland University of Technology, for sharing her time, knowledge, and expertise as resource speaker during the Environmental Law Teachers Training Program, third session, Methodology in the Teaching of Environmental Law, held via Zoom virtual conference, and given this 13th day of October in the year of our Lord, 2021 in Manila. On behalf of the board, signed by Chairperson Ana Marie Melanie B. Trinidad. Okay, so before we end today's session, we would like to invite everyone to join us for an interview. As your organizer, we want to hear from you on your thoughts and views in this environmental law training program. For those who would like to be interviewed, kindly fill up the form sent in our chat box and we will schedule a date for you. Again, reminder to everyone to kindly fill up the attendance form and the evaluation form for your attendance. The evaluation form and attendance form is now in the chat box and will also be sent in your email after the session. We will also send your email address the link in our next session on October 20, so please check your inbox and spam messages. Should you have any questions or concerns with the Zoom link, you may contact our team through Gabriel at gabriel.gab.matola@lev.gov.ph. Again, we remind everyone that compliance to at least 9 sessions is required for the issuance of the training certificate. We hope everyone gained valuable knowledge through this very insightful lecture of Professor Amanda, and we are glad that you can join us for today. See you on our next session on October 20. Thank you everyone for attending.